Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Can you hear me at the back? It's all right. I would like to begin rather by thanking the organizers for the very kind invitation. It's an honor to be invited to address you. It's also very interesting for me because one of the first things I noted during the introductory speeches just now is the sense of optimism that you have. Am I right in assuming that you have an optimism with regard to the future of, with regard to the state of education, of Islamic education in Australia, and also with regard to the future of Islamic education in Australia, and maybe even with regard to the future of Islam in Australia. Is that right? Yes. Because in my experience, coming from a Muslim country, my country is Malaysia, but also familiar with Indonesia and many other Muslim countries, as I'm sure many of you are, we have a great sense of pessimism. We have serious problems, which I would like to touch upon in my talk. Now, my talk really, to give it an alternative title, which is a lot more simpler to understand, is extremism and justice in Islam. In other words, I'm talking about the relationship between extremism and justice, which I understand to be social justice. There is, I think, such a thing as individual justice. One can be just or unjust to oneself. But I think even in the case of individual justice, it doesn't make sense if we do not talk about it in the context of society, because human beings do not exist except in the context of society. Therefore, by definition, justice is social justice. There may, of course, be the economic dimension of social justice, the cultural dimension, the political dimension, and so on. But justice has to be about society, because insofar as human beings exist within the context of their relations with other human beings, whether it is one other human being, such as the relationship between a couple, or with the context of an individual in a group, in a community, in a neighborhood, in an ethnic group, or in a larger society. So my presentation is about the relationship between Muslim extremism and justice in Islam. Now, there are many studies on in the social sciences and humanities on the issue of the larger issue of Muslim revivalism and the specific case of extremist revivalist movements. There are many studies, but most of these studies are about the origins or the causes of revivalism. And there are, many theories that speak about the origins of revivalism. Some say that revivalism has to do with relative deprivation, with economic poverty, with the loss of identity, and so on and so forth. For example, many studies say that the causes of revivalism have to do with the defeat of Palestinians on the Arabs in general at the 1967 war. Others explain the rise of Muslim revivalism in terms of the discovery of oil in the Gulf and the expenditure on religious education by the oil-rich nations, and so on and so forth. So there are many theories. my talk today is not about the causes of Muslim revivalism and specifically extremism, but rather the nature, what it is. See, when you talk about any phenomena, in society, we may speak about the origins of that phenomena. We may speak about the impact or the function of that phenomena in society, or we may speak about its nature, its characteristics. Whatever subject you speak about, and this may be something that's good to talk. It's good to explain this to students. It helps them to organize their thoughts. Whatever topic you speak about, whatever phenomenon you speak about, it will either be about the origins of that phenomenon, the function or impact of that phenomenon, or the definition or the nature of that phenomenon, right? So if our topic is Muslim revivalism, if our topic is Muslim extremism, it could be about the origins of Muslim extremism, it could be about the function or the effect of Muslim extremism on society. But in my case, I'm going to speak about the actual nature of Muslim extremism. How do we define Muslim extremism? And what I'm suggesting is that Muslim extremism can only, from an Islamic point of view, can only be understood in terms of the Islamic conception of justice. And in fact, the Honorable Mufti had already had spoken about this need to be moderate, in other words, to establish a balance between extremes, between ifrat and tafrit, basically, that's what it is. This is what is meant by moderation. Now, and this is in fact a Quranic perspective, right? This idea of establishing mizan between extremes. Now, what I want to suggest is that when we speak about extremes, we can speak about extremes in various ways that refer to different issues and different challenges that we are facing in our society. And when we speak about the different types of extremes, and when we speak about the need to establish a balance between these different types of extremes, it takes us to a discussion on the nature or characteristics of extremism in Muslim societies, and of course the opposite of that, which would be justice. Before I speak directly on that topic, let me just say a few words about the context. Now, that has something to do. It also has something to do with what in Australia you often refer to. How do you put it? Acknowledging the traditional. Sorry. The traditional owners of the land, right? Okay. Now, what that refers to is a recognition and awareness of the continuing state of coloniality in the world today. Now, the continuing state of coloniality does not only refer to what you call the Aboriginal communities or First Nation, but it refers indeed to the entire world encompassing Asia, Africa, and Latin America, right? Now, coloniality is a state that began. You could trace it back to the beginnings of capitalism, which coincided with the so-called discovery of America, and with that, the decimation of so-called Native Americans, with the transatlantic slave trade. And following that, the various campaigns of colonization of not only the Americas, but also large areas of Africa and Asia. And with colonization, the not only physical genocide of people, but also the destruction of knowledge systems, right? Referring to Africans, to Native Americans, to Asians, and so on. So that happened not only to the so-called Aboriginal people or First Nations, but also to the others, right? And that is the situation that we live in today. And the cultural dimension of that problem of coloniality is intellectual imperialism or academic imperialism that we still suffer from. So these are, you could refer to this as the external problem as far as education is concerned. There's also the internal problem, of course, which I may, if I have time, I may touch upon that later. There are problems that are generated within Muslim societies in the areas of education for which we cannot blame the West or for which we cannot blame imperialism. But this is the context, this context of coloniality. We are formally independent. Asia, Africa, and Latin America, formally independent, politically independent, but in terms of economic structures, in terms of economic development, in terms of cultural integrity, in terms of the entire education system, we are still in a state of coloniality. I only have to give you the example of the international ranking system. Our ranking depends on the ability to which we are recognized in the academic intellectual centers of the West. So the ranking of a university in Punjab, the ranking of the University of Brunei Darussalam, the ranking of the University of Malaya depends on the extent to which you are read, your works published in basically American or British journals are published in those journals and are read by people in those centers. It's irrelevant as to the contribution that you make to your own society, because that's not captured in the international ranking systems. So that's just one example of academic dependency. This is one of the issues that I actually write a lot about, and I'd be happy to discuss it more later. So coloniality is one context, but there's also another context, and that's the brutality of regimes in Muslim societies, most Muslim societies, right? We always complain about it, but it's the norm. It has been the norm since the founding of the Bani Umayyad in Muslim societies. Brutal regimes. Ibn Khaldun himself said that something like, he said, injustice or unjust decisions is the norm. Government decisions are as a rule unjust, he said. As a rule unjust. And I think this is true. Historically, this is very true. The difference is today, Muslim regimes, Muslim states are very rarely independent, generally beholden to the powers, controlled by the powers, whether the United States or Britain, France, or even Russia. Now, any discussion on justice or adala in the Islamic context must be related to the key concepts of mizan or moderation or wasatiyah. To be in a state of moderation means to establish a balance between two extremes. The establishment of that balance is the achievement of justice. This is something that I think we are all familiar with. This is because a specific attribute of adala is mizan, or balance. And this idea of mizan, or balance, applies not only to God's justice, but also to the justice of human beings as well. As Ibn Khaldun noted, justice is a balance set up among mankind. So this is in reference to social justice, although the term in Islamic tradition doesn't exist, social justice. But when Ibn Khaldun says that justice is a balance set up among mankind, it means social justice. Now, what I'm doing in my presentation is to examine the different dimensions of moderation in society that would together define social justice. I focus on specific dichotomies And this, I think, point is important. I focus on specific dichotomies such as Zahir Batin, tradition modernity, private public, and autonomy regulation in order to develop a contemporary understanding of moderation. See, I talk about these various dichotomies, yes? We're talking about a dichotomy between ifrat and tafrit, right? But ifrat and tafrit are general, abstract. We can understand ifrat and tafrit in terms of zahir batin, in terms of tradition, modernity, in terms of, what else did I say, private and public. There are various continua, which we have to identify and place ourselves in the middle of. So, for example, I will just give you a specific example. The continua of Zahir Batin, right? This one is simple. We all know this. That to be a Muslim, you should, in your practice of Islam, be in the middle between the Zahir and Batin. You can't say, that I just practice the Zahir aspects, the appearance of, being a Muslim, for example, the movements of the Salat, for example, without the inner religious experience, without the Batin aspect. You can't do that. You can't go to the other extreme and say, well, the inner experience is enough. The spiritual experience is enough. I don't need to perform the Salat. I don't need to perform the physical acts and so on. Right? You can't be on that end of the continuum either. You have to be in the middle. Right? Being in the middle is being moderate. It is avoiding the two extremes. Now, let me suggest that there are other continua, other dichotomies that are pertinent to being extreme or being moderate in the modern world today. These continua that I'm speaking about have to do with specific aspects of our lives in the modern world today. Now, one, I have identified actually in my presentation six continua, but there would be more, I think. I've just identified 6. Now let me, what I'm going to do in the rest of my presentation, and I forgot to ask how much time I have.
I'll let you know.
No, but you must let me know now so I can plan.
You've got 25 minutes.
25 minutes left, okay.
30 minutes. We'll give you extra 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. What I'm going to do in the rest of the presentation is to discuss briefly these 6 continua and then give an example from real life cases of the failure to establish the balance with reference to 2 continua. Okay, I hope it's clear what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to be as concrete as possible and not too abstract. Okay, now the 6 continua. The first one is inclusivism versus exclusivism. Again, avoiding the 2 extremes of being totally inclusivist as opposed to being totally exclusivist. We need to be somewhere in the middle. Let me give you an example. As Muslims, we want to be inclusive. For example, in Singapore, for example, at the mosque that I go to, the Masjid Ba'alawi, during the month of Ramadan, without fail every year, dates are distributed to not only the Muslim community, but also to the entire neighborhood around the mosque, whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim. In that sense, there's a sense of inclusivity. Non-Muslims are often, routinely in fact, invited to the mosque for iftar, as well as on other occasions outside of the month of Ramadan. So there is a strong sense of inclusivity. Of course, inclusivity doesn't go to the extent whereby we ask the Christians and the Jews and the Buddhists to come to the musalla and worship in the musalla, right? We do recognize certain boundaries, and we recognize that other religions also have certain boundaries. We are not, and we avoid exclusivity in the sense that we don't say well, dates are only for Muslims, we don't distribute dates to non-Muslims, we don't allow non-Muslims to come to the mosque, we don't allow non-Muslims to come to the musalla. There are many Muslims who say that. Even in Singapore, in Malaysia certainly, people complain that non-Muslims are allowed to even visit the mosque. You have this problem of exclusivism. Right now in Malaysia, for several years, there is a move to define Islam in terms of the Shafi'i school. Here you have a problem of exclusivism. And in fact, I'll refer to this later, people who don't adhere to the Shafi'i school, especially non-Sunnis, are not only criticized but also persecuted. And I'll say more about that later on. So, the inclusivism-exclusivism dichotomy. Now, there's another dichotomy, another continua, if you want to put it that way, between tradition and modernity. We respect tradition, but we also live in the modern world, and there are requirements of modern life. So there is a need to strike a balance. We don't want to destroy tradition, but we need to negotiate tradition in such a way that we can live in the modern world. We also recognize certain positive aspects of modernity, and we don't blindly cling on to traditions. To give you a very simple example, and I'm going to talk in more detail about it when I give my empirical illustration of the problem of failing to establish the balance between tradition and modernity later. But for now, a simple example. We respect old buildings, but the old buildings need in some ways to be refurbished and renovated and restructured so that they don't collapse, right? But we renovate, we restructure in such a way that it preserves the ambience of the old. It preserves the character of the old. So we don't go to the extent of saying, don't touch the building, leave it alone because it's traditional. We don't go to the other extent of saying that demolish the building and erect a modern structure. But I'd like to give a concrete example of the failure to establish this balance later. Now, the third continuum that I'm speaking about, law versus spirituality. The entrenchment of legalistic thinking among Muslims had led to a de-emphasis on spirituality and the religious experience. And what this reflects is a lack of balance between the exoteric, or the zahir, and the esoteric, the batin dimensions of Islam, which is and I would say this is primarily due to the decline in spiritualistic traditions, Sufi traditions in Islam, that you have this domination of legalism, particularly in the modern period, beginning in the 19th century. So this legalism, expressed in terms of the failure to establish a balance between the zahir and the batin, is also another dimension of extremism. Now, a fourth dichotomy is between coercion and freedom. Coercion versus freedom. Or you can put it in terms of regulation versus the sanctity of personal life. Now, we believe in freedom. At the same time, we recognize the need to regulate so that to prevent individuals from infringing upon the freedom of others. It's very important to strike that balance, to allow freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of cultural, intellectual expression, just to be free to be autonomous as an individual. We recognize that. At the same time, we cannot allow individuals to be totally free because it infringes upon the freedom of others. So it's logical that there has to be a balance, right? But what happens if this idea of regulation goes, extreme? Now in Malaysia, I'm giving examples from Malaysia because that's my country. So I feel it is more appropriate to criticize your own country and not hurt, people's feelings. But I could easily give similar examples from other countries. Now in Malaysia, which you all, by the way, think is a moderate Muslim country, right? And in many ways it is, and it's maybe among the most livable of Muslim countries. In terms of standard of living, in terms of the dignity of the human being, it's more livable. That is true. But there are many things that you'll be surprised of. For example, we have laws in some states in Malaysia because religious life is a matter of the state in Malaysia. It's regulated by the government. It's decentralized. It's not regulated by the federal government, but by state governments. We have in some states, you can be arrested. Imagine this. You can be arrested for missing Friday prayers more than 3 times in a row. You can be arrested and fined or jailed. So this is the kind of warped thinking that we have in our country. It's an example of extremism because it is, an excessive notion of regulation. The idea of regulating people's personal life to that extent. And of course, you probably know we have laws against khalwat. For khalwat, I'm not referring to the Sufi practice of khalwat. Khalwat here, in the case of Sharia, Malaysian understanding of Sharia, refers to a couple found in close proximity, couple who are not married, found in close proximity. So we don't only say that, we don't only advise people not to practice khalwat, but we also regulate their lives by raiding them. So for example, the authorities raid hotels, they raid homes. If they receive a tip-off that there's a couple, not married, but together, they raid them, right? And they can be, if they are not found guilty of zina, they can still be found guilty of khalwat and fined, right? And sometimes married couples have been, I think there was a German couple who were married, but it was a mistaken case, false tip-off. And their hotel room was raided, and the couple was horrified, and I think they ran away from Malaysia. I don't think they would ever come back. And I have a friend who's an activist. He was raided in the early hours of the morning. He was in the hotel with his mother. He was traveling from another state, from his state, he was traveling to another state, staying in the hotel with his mother, and there was a tip-off, and he was raided. The religious authorities came early in the morning to check, to ask him, who is this woman that you are with? So this is the idea of regulation that we have. It is extreme. A failure to establish a balance between, on the one hand, needing to regulate to a certain extent, on the other hand, respecting the autonomy and the freedom of individuals. Now, I also discuss another continuum, another dichotomy, literal versus figurative. Here, this is another instance of the lack of balance between the zahir and the batin, but it has to do with, on the one hand, excessive concerns with zahir in matters of interpretation of texts that may lead to problematic orientations, for example, anthropomorphism in theological doctrines, right? So it's also an issue of zahir batin, but here it has to do with the interpretation of text. The sixth dichotomy that I'm talking about is universalism versus particularism. If we establish that injustice is to be defined as imbalance, it follows that to the I have, as I said, I have the last continuum that I'm talking about is universalism and particularism. Now, I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, just to say that there is a need, in this case, there is a need to strike that balance. In other words, we say Islam is universal religion. We say rules and regulations, concepts, ideas are universal. But we also have to recognize that there's an extent to which certain ideas in Islam, certain rules even, are particular to a certain time and place and context, and have to be understood in that way, right? Otherwise, it becomes impossible to live as a Muslim. So, for example, we say prayer, salat, dua are universal practices, valid for all times. It's impossible to say that, in these days it's impractical to pray 5 times a day. You can't say that. It's simply not true. But then we can think of some practices which are particular to a time. For example, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, there are some hadith which suggest that it's a bad practice to return home after a trip at night, right? Now, we can't practice that today. It's not possible. Your flight arrives, at night. You come from the US. Your flight arrives at night. Are you supposed to go to a hotel and stay, the night at the hotel and then go to your home later? Now, we can understand the reason for the Prophet saying these things, right? Because in those days, first of all, you can plan your trip. Secondly, when you arrive at night, you upset the whole household, right? There's no lighting. You make a noise when you come in. The notion of privacy is different. It's not that houses have different bedrooms with doors. It's not the same kind of setup. So arriving home from a long trip at night means you upset the whole household. Things are different today. You have rooms with walls. You have doors. You have electricity. You can tiptoe into the house. You can tiptoe even into your bedroom, and you can tiptoe into the bathroom and freshen up, have your shower, and then tiptoe to your wardrobe, get your pajamas, climb into your pajamas, climb into bed quietly, and your wife or your husband may never know what happened, right? That's what you do, yeah. So this is just a simple example of how some ideas are universalistic and some are particular, and we need to strike that. Now, what I want to do in the last few minutes is to give an example of this failure to establish balance. In other words, the failure to achieve social justice in terms of 2 continua or 2 dichotomies that I mentioned just now. The first one is the tradition-modernity dichotomy. The failure to establish the balance between tradition and modernity. An example of that. The example of this is from the destruction of heritage in Saudi Arabia. Here you have an utter failure to establish the balance between tradition and modernity, because you have the destruction of the old buildings, including the family of the Prophet, including some Sahaba, right? And in the place of these buildings, you have the erection of the icons of capitalism, right? Even in the West, which some Muslims severely criticize for being secular, there is more respect. The West is not as guilty of cultural kufr as Muslims are. If you go to Europe, you go to any European medieval town, there are laws. First of all, there are very strong laws against the destruction of the old buildings from the old cities, and there are laws that prevent you from building higher than the old buildings. Right? If you go to Amsterdam, for example, you cannot build higher than so many floors within a certain radius of the old city. But not in Saudi Arabia. Look what they've done in Mecca, around the Haram, right? The clock tower and the hotels and what is it? Not Buck Rogers, McDonald's, I think. But it's a very interesting case. It is a destruction of heritage that is justified by Islam. That is justified by a certain interpretation of Islam. Because what of the heritage is destroyed? For example, the house of Sidi Khadija is destroyed. I don't know what they built. Was it a car park or a public toilet? A public toilet, right? Can you imagine that? But what is the destruction is done in the name of Islam, because it is destroyed to prevent bid'ah, right? That particular interpretation of Islam. But then you have the replacement in the place of these structures. As I said, you have the icons of capitalism. Are you familiar with Max Weber? He wrote a book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. In this book, Max Weber said that he tried to explain the origins of capitalism in Europe. He said that there are specific characteristics of Protestant belief that unwittingly led to the accumulation of capital. Protestants had to lead an ascetic lifestyle, but they also had to work hard in the world. So if you were a Protestant merchant, you worked very hard. You accumulated capital. You couldn't spend the capital. You couldn't spend your profits because you had to lead an ascetic lifestyle. So the only thing you could do was to reinvest your capital. So it led to increasing amounts of accumulation of capital, right? So there was what Max Weber called an affinity between the Protestant attitude towards life, that God expected you to work hard because working hard was a sign of your salvation. Being successful in your work was a sign of salvation. But you couldn't spend from what you earned because you had to lead an ascetic, simple, frugal lifestyle. So that led to capital accumulation. If I had the opportunity one day, inshallah, I would like to write a book called The Salafi Ethic and the Rise of Vulgar Capitalism. Because what you're having is, not only in Saudi Arabia, but in some other countries, a kind of very vulgar capital accumulation. Vulgar because it has no respect for tradition, not only architectural tradition, but other kinds of traditions, but often justified in the name of Islam. And this is what the field of Islamic economics is about. It's basically neoclassical economics dressed up in Islamic terminology, but has a strong affinity with capitalism, right? I just have a few minutes left. The other example I wanted to give of extremism, the failure to establish a balance. In this case, it is a balance between inclusivism and exclusivism. This is from Malaysia. This is from the persecution of Shiites in Malaysia. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, that this is happening. My country is a moderate country, supposedly. But in this matter, we have become among the most extreme of countries. Shiites are literally persecuted. Every year, during Ashura, Shiites are raided, their places of worship are raided, and they are detained and questioned. Their materials are confiscated. There are fatwas, and fatwas are not simply legal opinions in Malaysia. Fatwas are enforceable. There are fatwas that declare that Shiism is heretical or deviant, along with other orientations such as Ahmadiyya, feminism, feminism also, liberalism, and so on. But Shiites are declared as deviant. They have been arrested throughout the years, and it's certainly illegal to spread Shiite teachings. There is hate speech against Shiites. Our social media is full of hate speech. Just a few days ago, there was to be a seminar on the Aman message, which Malaysia is signatory to. You're all familiar with the Aman message. It was to take place, I think, this weekend. I was invited to be a speaker, but I couldn't accept because I was to come here. But just a few days ago, it was reported in the press that the seminar was cancelled because of a bomb threat, right? People who are against Sunni Shiite unity. So we have this problem of sectarianism throughout the Muslim world, but I'm giving the illustration from Malaysia, the failure to establish that balance. It has become such that there in at least one state that I know of, I don't know about other states, but one state in Malaysia, it's not even possible to have a marriage between a Sunni and a Shiite. Because the Qadi refuses to, the official position is that the marriage is not legitimate. And the religious authorities would not conduct such a marriage. Can you imagine that? 35 years ago. Yes, exactly 35 years ago when I got married. I'm Sunni, my wife is Shiite. My wife is from Iran. We got married in Johor, the state of Johor. Not a single question, nobody asked a question. Yes. Nobody asked it, it was not an issue at all. Now, it's become a big issue. Couples have broken up. Since 1996, when fatwas around the country were issued declaring Shiites as heretical, some couples broke up. Parents got involved. Husbands and wives became uncomfortable with each other because they began to think, yes, there's something wrong with the Shiites. So here you have a clear example of the imbalance between inclusivism and exclusivism. We accept differences. We accept that we have boundaries. There are some aspects of Shiite thinking that we cannot accept, for example. But do we go, so we don't go to one extreme of being totally inclusivist and say, pretend there's no difference. On the other hand, do we go to the other extent and be exclusivist and exclude them from our community? So I have to conclude now. I have a long conclusion, but I'm not going to read the whole conclusion. Let me just say this. Just give me a minute. Why should we be concerned with social justice? Political liberty, economic equality and prosperity, cultural integrity, the respect for the individual, and the possibility of living with dignity. These are the basic problems that we're having in much of the Muslim world. Social justice must encompass gender, racial, and religious justice, requiring the balance between inclusivism and exclusivism. Justice is about achieving the above. Therefore, there is an imperative to adhere to the theological meaning of justice, that is, the Quranic injunction to achieve the balance between extremes, because, as Ibn Khaldun said, justice is a balance set up among mankind. In other words, theology is decidedly social because it involves not abstract individuals, but people in the context of groups and communities and the web of relations that those entail. Recognition of this imperative means holding Muslim communities and societies accountable for justice. It means identifying, studying, exposing, challenging, and resisting injustice. Such injustices that are widespread in the Muslim world include mini-apartheids of all sorts, misogyny and gender discrimination, sectarianism, violation of human rights, and freedom of expression. We are also required speaking out against extremist ideologies, whether Salafi or Sunni or Shiite dimensions of extremism, and the creation of trans-sectarian alliances against extremism. The targets of our wrath are not only Muslim extremists, but also Western market and secular fundamentalists, Islamophobes, and regimes that in different ways support or influence the rise and development of extremism among Muslims. Thank you very much.